Saul of Tarsus waited for 3 days in the city of Damascus for someone to come to him and tell him what he needed to do. Acts chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. Now this was no doubt a trying time for this heartbroken man. 3 days, full of grief, repentance, and prayer. He refused to eat and drink. He knew that he was in trouble, and he knew that he had to do something about it. But he was forced to wait. Jesus had commanded him to do so, and Saul had found a new respect for Jesus. On the road to Damascus, Saul had seen the risen Lord and had been struck blind by the same. At that, Saul no doubt knew that he had gotten off easy, for Saul had been hunting down, imprisoning, torturing, even killing Christians. And the first words of Christ to Saul had been, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" Saul had been persecuting Jesus because he had been convinced that Jesus was a fraud and that Christianity was a lie and was a threat to Judaism. But upon seeing the risen Lord in his glory, Saul was converted. Saul went from a persecutor to a believer in record time. And being a man who desired to please God, it no doubt broke Saul's heart to know how wrong he had been. It would not be unfair for us to deduce that his prayers were prayers of penitence. They were pleas of mercy and forgiveness. But rather than immediately telling him what he needed to do, Jesus commanded Saul to go into the city and wait. And so Saul waited for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, Jesus appeared to a man named Ananias and told him to go to Saul, heal him, and tell Saul what he needed to do, which Ananias, after some protesting about the character of Saul, agreed. Years later, when Saul recalled that encounter with Ananias, he remembered it quite vividly. It must have been quite a moment for him, the climax of 3 days of worry and anxiety and blindness. Saul had been left alone with little but simply his wounded conscience. And then there was Ananias coming to him, explaining that Jesus had sent him, healing Saul of his blindness, and telling Saul what Jesus expected of him. He had work to do for Christ. He was to be an ambassador, an apostle, sent to the Gentiles to teach them about Jesus. But first, there was something that Saul still needed to do. He had to make things right with God. So Ananias, chastising Saul, he says in Acts 22 and verse 16, "And now, why tarriest thou? Why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord." Why had Saul waited? Because Jesus had told him to. But 3 days was enough waiting. Paul needed to do what was right, to get rid of those sins that were still separating him from God. He needed to obey the command of Jesus and be baptized for the remission of his sins and to be brought into the family of God. Years later, another apostle, Peter, would write, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness and lust and drunkenness and revelries and drinking and abominable idolatries," 1 Peter 4 and verse 3. Now the question comes to us. How long did we stay in sin? Was it for a year, 5, 10, 20 years? However long it was enough and then some. We've spent too much of our lives in sin, even if it was only a minute. It was more than enough. We don't need to waste any more of our time. How long should we wait before we do what we need to do? For Saul, it was 3 days. For some, it may be 3 years, it may be 30 years, but whatever the length of time, the message for us today is the same as the message of Ananias to Saul of Tarsus many years ago. Why do you wait? Why do you continue to put it off? Arise and be baptized, wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Make your life right with God today. Thank you for listening today. Please consider these things. May God bless.